I'm going to continue the tradition of telling the story of Esther as opposed to reading it for you. It's a story that many of us are somewhat familiar with, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the Jewish community tells the story every year in a very interactive way. And the reason they do that is because in the end, it's a story of ironic justice. It's a story of ironic justice. And what I mean by that is that the villain in the story, Haman, who we'll circle back and talk about him in a moment, he builds a scaffold, a ridiculously large scaffold, for the very purpose of hanging a Jew named Mordecai. But in the middle of the story, it's Haman himself who is hanged on the scaffold, not the Jew Mordecai. So there's that kind of ironic twist to the story. And likewise, they set a date by which Haman aims to annihilate all the Jews. But on that date, it's the Jews who are armed and empowered to overcome their enemies. So when our friends tell this story year after year, they tell it as a story of justice, of ironic justice. But a couple of years ago, for the celebration of Purim, we presented this story along with our Jewish friends. And I noticed that Rabbi Marcia Tilchin did something kind of interesting. She softened the edges of the story a little bit on occasion. She would throw out a little caveat. And you have to do that because there are two things in particular about this story that are incredibly offensive. One is that by the end of the story, there's just a vengeance-filled bloodbath going on in the story. And that seems to be the point of the story. So those of us who aim to live peaceably, and those of us for whom vengeance belongs to God and not to ourselves, we have to kind of bracket that part of the story. And so Rabbi Marcia did her best to soften the edges a little bit. But also, this is a story about hyper-patriarchal culture. I mean, seriously, it's patriarchy on steroids in this story. And there's a lot about it that's not just kind of quirky, because it's never quite fair to take a culture from 3,000 years ago and to judge them by today's standards. But there are parts of this story that are just so incredibly offensive that in order to tell the story, we have to first make a note of it and call it what it is. It's odious. So, for example, in the story, we all know that Esther becomes the queen. She's probably rather young. And, so it's a story of a Jewish girl who becomes the queen of the Persian Empire. And in that respect, sounds like an aspiring story. But as you read the details of the story, it's horrific. Esther is rounded up with all of the young and fertile and attractive girls of the area. She's rounded up, and for 1 year, they're given spa treatments, baths in ass's milk, ointments, unguents, all of these things that are supposed to make their skins beautiful and make their bodies beautiful, make them presentable. For 1 year, they're given these spa treatments, which sounds like a good time, but the point of it is that then they're all presented to the king, one a night. And if he finds them acceptable, one of these lucky gals gets to be the queen. And for the ones that are not the lucky gal that gets to be the queen, they get put into the king's harem, where they live until their services are needed again. That's going on in this story. And this is why I just have to battle again and say one more time that reading the Bible as a fundamentalist just simply doesn't work. Because this is not a prescriptive story about how God does work. And this is not a prescriptive story of how we ought to live. This kind of commodification of young women, let's call them what they are, girls, for the pleasure of men, is wrong. It's wrong whether we're talking about the scourge of human trafficking. It's wrong whether we're talking about a professed billionaire that's supposed to be some great philanthropist who has an island that his insider friends call Pedophile Island. Even if he's kind of best buds with both a Democratic and a Republican president, it's still wrong. And it's wrong when it's in the Bible. So, even though we're reading the scriptures, this presentation of the way things worked is not the Word of God. It's a description of a culture that's very far away from what the Word of God calls us to be. So, we listen to the story of Esther, and we have these great caveats that it's a bloodbath, and that's not something that, should we read the rest of the scriptures, we're willing to accept as God's way. And it's a patriarchy that is systemic and violating, exploitative of women, which is why we're going to call Queen Vashti the hero of this story. Or, as some of my friends suggest, the shero of this story. Queen Vashti. Because while we don't know what's going on in her mind, and while it is clear that as the story begins, she's complicit in what's happening here, this lavish banquet and so forth, there is a point at which she says no. It takes a certain amount of privilege and power to be able to do that. But there's a point at which Queen Vashti says no. And she pays a horrible price for it. And whether she's a follower of God or a pagan or irreligious, not religious, a nun, matters not. She's the hero of this story because she was confronted with what was wrong and she resisted. And you would think that perhaps with Vashti as the hero that Ahasuerus, the king, would be the villain, but in fact, the king is kind of a dope in this story. You know, he's kind of an egotistic narcissist who, because of that, becomes a tool for anybody who happens to be a little bit clever. So he's powerful for sure, but he's not a mover and a shaker. The villain in this story, the one pulling the levers behind the great power, is the man named Haman. We don't know how it happened or why it happened. We just know that when Haman's introduced, the king has made him the second most powerful person in all of the kingdom. And that means that he's wearing the king's signet ring, and it means that whatever Haman declares, he can do it in the name of the king. And Haman takes advantage of that. And he declares that whenever he walks out of the palace gates, everybody who sees him is required to get down and grovel. Obeisance is the kind of technical biblical word, but we know it means grovel. Everyone's supposed to bow and grovel when Haman comes out of the gate, and everybody does it. Every single body does it except a Jew named Mordecai. Mordecai. He's Esther's uncle and her adoptive father because she's an orphan. Mordecai has raised her since she was a child. And when she was swept into the king's harem to be prepared to see if she would be meet to become the queen, Mordecai followed. And he camped outside the gate day after day, inquiring about Esther. And this Jew named Mordecai every day would stand at the gate, and as the gates opened and the great Haman came out to much pomp and circumstance, everybody bowed down except Mordecai, who resisted, very much in the spirit of Queen Vashti. He resisted, and that's why Haman took it upon himself to declare that he was going to hang Mordecai, and he was going to annihilate all of Mordecai's people. This is a story about Haman's intention for genocide. And that's why when we hear the story as a story of ironic justice, there's just this great sigh of relief at the end of the story. Even though it's a bloodbath, it's a relief that the Jews were not annihilated there in the Persian Empire. So what happens then with this story of Vashti and Haman as we hear that story as a story of hero and villain? Well, there are a couple of things that it tells us. I'll remind you that this is a book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. And in some respects, what it tells us is not really how God rolls, but it tells us how we are. And when we look at this role of Haman, we see somebody who has a certain measure of power and authority, a certain measure of wealth, and is not satisfied. We see somebody who has everything everybody in the entire empire dreams of having, and is not satisfied. Once more. And we see what happens to people when they get power and when they get wealth. We see how corruptive it is to imagine that somehow by virtue of being chosen by the king, everybody else in the kingdom has to bow down and grovel at your feet. We see in Haman that temptation that many of us face whenever we have a measure of power, wealth, or authority. I know it's easy to talk about the 1%, and I know it's easy for virtually anybody who's not a quasi-billionaire to exempt themselves from it at that point. But as many of you know through your travels throughout the world, we're the privileged. We're the privileged. We don't even ask whether we could have a car, should have a car, can have a car. We ask whether we can have a new one, or the latest one, or the greatest one. We ask questions of the privileged. And that's just simply the position into which many of us have been born, and many of us have worked hard to reach that point. But when we read the story of Haman, we read the story of someone who has privilege and uses that privilege to leverage more power, more wealth, and more privilege. On the other hand, when we see the story of Queen Vashti, we read the story of someone who, what's the way they put it these days, who got woke. She woke up. Because when the story starts, Queen Vashti is just as much a part of the system as anybody else. The king's over in the court celebrating with all the men on a 7-day feast. Queen Vashti's in the castle. She's in the palace celebrating with the women. And we don't know if she's enjoined to do that by virtue of being the first lady, and therefore she has to be a super hostess. We don't know whether she does it reluctantly, or we don't know whether she enjoys doing that, because frankly, there are probably moments when Ahasuerus and Vashti looked at each other and said, it's good to be king. It's good to be queen. Because when the story begins, Vashti is enjoying. She's the queen. She's part of the system. She's complicit. And she is part of this profligate display of wealth and power that goes on in the first chapter of the book of Esther. But then something happens. Something happens that triggers in Vashti an awareness of how exploitative the system is. Vashti wakes up. And this is the call for anybody who has enjoyed the excess of privilege. There comes a moment when what we've enjoyed and the price that others pay for it becomes apparent. And the question is whether we will wake up. Maybe we've gone this far, but we realize we can go no further. Maybe there comes that moment where we realize that we are part of a corrupt system. And while we may not be able to change it, and while we may simply be exiled for saying it, there comes a time when you and I have to look at this pagan queen and say, she's done something heroic. Because she had the courage to look at her own lifestyle, her own privilege, and say, enough. So I invite you, as we hear the story of Esther, as we take it with us throughout the week, Let's not shortchange Queen Vashti. She's the forgotten character in this story. She's dispensed with after the first chapter, and we move on to Esther. But let's not disparage, let's not forget Queen Vashti. Because of all of the heroes in the Bible, her moment of waking up to the privilege that she has is probably the most precise definition of what God is calling God's people to do in America today. And may God give us the courage to be that kind of a hero. Amen.